Hello and welcome to the Change by Design podcast, where we cast a light on all things engineering transformation. I'm Josh Corman, head of content at Lifecycle Insights, and I am joined again by Lifecycle Insights CEO and Chief Analyst Chad Jackson. Chad, we are here in the middle of February. How are you feeling?
Pretty good. Gosh, I can't believe I don't know, what week is this? 7, 8 into the new year. Yeah, it's going really fast. It's going way faster than I expected, but that happens every year.
It's true. It always does. We talked last week about engineering at the Olympics. I've continued my trend of passing February and the winter by tuning into some of those. And we talked about engineering storylines. I'm still fascinated by the engineer and the skeleton heading downhill face first at high speeds. I wonder if anyone has thought to use. Surely they've used simulation technologies, right, to map the optimum paths and wind resistance and all that stuff. I hope as an engineer he's advocating for using some of these
Yeah.
fancy tools that we talk about in other contexts to help inch a little closer to a metal.
No, I think that's absolutely true, especially for, any equipment. You look at those. Oh, what are the sleds that they jump on to go down? Is it
Oh
a
yeah,
skeleton? Is that
the
what it's
the
called?
bob the bobsleds are the ones where they sit in, and then the skeleton. It really looks like a boogie board that if you ever do catching waves in the ocean, it looks about like that. Size and shape. It doesn't seem much more advanced aside from the
Yeah.
skates kind of on the bottom. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
we know that race teams do it. Why not individuals hurtling down icy slopes at 90 miles an hour?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that can even get to the point of the right one for an individual, right? Because airflow around a different body shape will be different, and you need to design the thing they go down on to match that and optimize it. So yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
you hear that, engineers? If you're bored running simulations on, some sort of mechanical product or, an automobile, and you want to, get a little bit closer to the world of the Olympics, maybe you can pitch the value of running simulations on on Olympic events and shave a few seconds off. But we'll leave the athletes. I'm going to keep watching. I'm going to keep my ears out for engineering storylines. But we're going to jump into today's topics and what we're talking about. And we're going to kick off with, a group that we haven't talked about a ton, but I know that, you have a ton of experience in kind of keeping tabs on what is coming out on the software side of the engineering world, what tools are being made available, how those are serving the needs of engineering organizations. And um,
Mhm.
we've researched and written and talked a lot about that over the years. I know last week we just talked about a conference that you came back from, put on by a software provider where you get to kind of see all this stuff up front and talk
Yeah.
to folks who are in the middle of it. But I know that you have some questions sort of about the state of software providers as they are now, and are they speaking to and serving the needs of where engineering is and where it's going, probably more importantly. So
Yeah.
talk a little bit
Mhm.
about that and where you kind of feel like that landscape lives at the moment.
Yeah, I'm concerned. Let me put it that way. So I guess the context here, we talked about this many, many times, the amount of software on these things, these end items, whether they're aircraft, you know, cars, tractors, medical equipment, medical devices, the amount of software is just exploding on them. And practically not only are all the features enabled by software, um, you're now getting to software defined products, right? So
Mhm.
you tweak some software, you get entirely new features onto the thing. Um, and that is enabled by electronics and electrical systems like networks. So different electronic endpoints can communicate with each other. And my big concern is that while a lot of companies are trying to reconcile the hardware and software development cycles, like you see Agile being adopted and
Mhm.
Agile teams that are cross functional, we're not seeing those systems kind of come together for for hardware and software development. And for example, I mean, I've yet to see a PLM solution be integrated tightly with an ALM solution, such that they're blended and you can't even tell where the boundary of one ends and the other one begins. And that's hugely problematic because the biggest issues that we're seeing is integration between hardware and software. And a lot of companies run into that late in the development cycle, and it causes significant delays, cost overruns, and all sorts of stuff like that. So you're seeing, we've had a lot of podcast guests that talked about frequent prototyping,
Mhm.
right? So the way they're figuring out, okay, what are the biggest issues around getting this thing out is, well, let's build a physical prototype. And to me, that's an indictment on how the IT solutions that are available today are not good enough, right? And something needs to be done about that. And there's a gap for someone to fill.
That's interesting. You talk about, kind of, I guess, closing this gap. And you're right. We've talked a lot of time as you were talking, right? I came back to your statement about kind of what is this big problem. The biggest problem that a lot of companies face is this integration point as, software becomes a
Yeah.
more, like you said, prevalent part of product development. And, I guess for a layperson, I can ask it this way. What what features, what functionality, do we need to see to fill that gap? To
Yeah.
give the practitioners an opportunity to more seamlessly or in a more streamlined fashion kind of bridge this gap before you get to that end point where you have to build a prototype and see, does the software function
Yeah.
as we expected it to? What else do we need to change? What would it look like? What would those improvements maybe look like that we could see that would help close the gap for some of these companies?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's really good existing kind of frameworks, right? So you look in almost any PLM solution, it supports this process. It goes through design and development, hits design release. Here's all the hardware documentation you need to source it and make this stuff. And then you have a change process that kind of controls additional changes to it. That's the flow for hardware. For software, it's very different. It's develop, uh, build, and then have a CI/CD. So continuous integration, continuous deployment. And what that means is every time, and you get many, many different developers working on the same piece of code or application, whenever they submit a piece of work, it's integrated into the main, branch of the software. And it can be continuously deployed. Now, in the software solution space, that means pushing it to the cloud. Okay, we're going to push it to a production site, maybe a preview site on the cloud. But for what we're talking about, which is software running on end items, vehicles, aircraft, medical devices, it is the initial flash of the software onto the electronics of those things, and then you ship it. But after that, it's over the air updates. So it's updating, you'll see this all the time with your TV, with your car, um, any kind of, there you go. Exactly. So you'll get updates that way. So there needs to be the capability to support both of those. And this is often ALM along with something like Git or GitHub, right? And this is often PLM with some worker data management. So those things to be merged because you know what? Requirements span both of those worlds. You make a change over here, you make a change over here, it might impact the same requirement. And you need to understand that. That's crucial because that directly contributes to these late stage problems. And today, they are separate solutions. So, for example, you look at, say, a PTC, you got Windchill for PLM. You have, they made an acquisition recently, and I'm blanking on the name, but a really good solution for ALM, really good solution, but they're not part of the same
Mhm.
stack. They may talk to one another, but they really need to be the same solution. Siemens has Team Center and Polarian, which are separate solutions, right? And, and there's the potential for those to become more and more integrated and maybe eventually become the same application, which is what I think needs to happen. But at least they have the right footprint. At least they have an ALM and a PLM solution out there. But you look at Autodesk, you look at Dassault Systems, they don't even have solutions that support, software development. Autodesk doesn't have anything around systems development.
Mhm.
Dassault has some systems development capabilities, but they don't have any electronics or semiconductor support. So there's an incomplete picture here.
Mhm.
Um, and no one is addressing the fundamental problem of how do you reconcile hardware and software development. And this problem, by the way, it is applicable up and down, not only supply chains, but also companies of varying sizes, right?
Mhm.
You see small OEMs that are startups that they have to get this to work, but also you see it in like Boeing and Northrop, right?
Mhm.
Huge aerospace defense primes. So I feel very passionate about this
Mhm.
because there are objections around why people don't do this that I do not buy into. And the problem is still out there.
So, hearing you talk about this, it sounds like
Yeah.
the end result of this equation as it stands now is that the burden gets passed on to the organizations to find ways to make the PLM and ALM solutions they might be using that might work well for those kind of, on those individual tracks. And they're having to find ways to bridge the gap. Like you said, maybe they talk to each other a little bit. Maybe the plan is to continue that integration pattern until they essentially become, one solution. But as it is right now, the responsibility for bridging that gap, as we talked about earlier, is falling to the companies, and nobody is kind of stepping into the breach to say, okay, you don't have to do that anymore here. We've addressed
Yeah.
this, this problem for you. And I know that we've talked too about competency development. I know how much you've talked about the importance of software, but obviously other things like semiconductors as well, playing
Hmm.
increasingly important roles in products, and the need to have competencies and obviously solutions to go alongside those that can help you actually
Yeah.
execute, on what you're doing. So, it feels like you're tossing up the softball and begging a provider to come grab a bat and
Well,
take a swing, but meet this moment.
so what's so interesting about this, Josh, is that maybe none of them do. And so here's what I see happening. Last week or the week before, Claude released Cowork, right?
Mhm.
Which is an automation tool. It can do lots of really interesting things for you. But there is a larger trend around using AI as almost like middleware. So middleware used to be custom integration between different enterprise IT systems that would let them talk with one another, and maybe you can extract some stuff out. And it was software that was custom, and it was always brittle. It always broke. You'd have to constantly go and fixing stuff. Well, there are organizations out there that are using AI as that middleware, and there's no custom code. It can deal with ambiguity, and it can go in and connect all these different things, pull out what you need, communicate back and forth. And I tell you what, if companies like Siemens and Dassault and Autodesk and PTC don't address this gap, people are going to be using AI for it. And
Mhm.
suddenly their solutions are going to become more commodity, more
Yeah.
infrastructure. And AI really becomes the layer that people actually use on a day-to-day basis to actually get this work done. So that's the dynamic at play. Um, Whether that's okay with some of these software providers, I don't know. A lot of people
Yeah.
don't like to be seen as infrastructure or commodity
Mhm.
because that means your ability to set pricing,
Mhm.
your power over that is eroded dramatically. So I don't know where it's going to go. Um, but it's a dynamic that will be super interesting.
Yeah, it sounds to me like there's a little bit of a parallel. I know we've had conversations with folks around, just stuff like project management, right? And I know that there are tools within these big, solutions for engineering organizations that manage some of that stuff. But we've talked to smaller companies where they're like, actually, we're just using Asana or Jira or these sort of off the shelf, planning software like project management softwares because either the complexity of the solution or the it doesn't fit the needs that we have. It's, not whatever. It's not accessible by everybody. It's not as simple to use.
Yeah.
Whatever their justifications, hearing that I know was a surprise when we had those conversations, and you were sort of like, "Oh, that's interesting that they just said, you know what, we're not going to wait around on the functionality we need from traditional engineering solution providers. So we're just going to go find a tool that fills the gap that we need right now." And
Yeah.
feels like a similar rationale could be used. And if the functionality is there and it does um, allow them to bridge that gap, then that is, you're right. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what people will use if it's available to them now and functions the way they need it to.
Yeah. And the AI companies will be more than happy to gobble up that spend that has traditionally been in IT for design and development and production and so on. Um, and by the way, that's why the markets reacted the way they did. There were some PLM providers that lost a significant market share. Their stock went down dramatically, but it wasn't just them. It was like a move in the market around almost all these enterprise software
Yeah.
providers. So it's definitely something to watch.
Yeah, and we've talked about the pace of AI development and how in 6 months we don't know what capabilities are going to look like. And you're right, each one of these new things, it does sort of send ripples, right, and shockwaves through, different tech adjacent industries because it's like, okay, well, now what does this mean, right? And now what is the new
Yeah.
paradigm and the new kind of line in the sand that we're all operating from? So fascinating to see. I know we've talked about AI a ton and talked about, the side of it on practitioners. So seeing kind of how software vendors side of things step in to fill some of those gaps and maybe step into the breach, like I said, and do some of what we've been kind of pontificating is coming next, right? And serve
Yeah.
practitioners in that way. So, um,
Right.
yeah, fascinating stuff. And I'm sure that we will continue to see news items and market movement and press releases related to this stuff in the coming years because it feels like it's just people waiting to grab the apple off the tree. It's hanging right there for them. But we can
Yeah.
shift gears a little bit. I know you mentioned a few minutes ago you've talked to a lot of folks, on the practitioner side of things, and recently a lot of conversations around model-based systems engineering. We talked about how MBSE is kind of a topical focus for us, and so we've been putting out these episodes with folks you've interviewed around that. And we recently posted one, I believe last week with Anand Brangaramu, and I know that
Mhm.
you found some interesting kind of tidbits and insights from that conversation that have been churning around in your mind. So talk a little bit about that conversation with Anand and kind of his role and the perspective that he shared in that
Yeah.
conversation that people can check out on the
Yeah.
podcast.
So he works for a company called the Shift Group. So they're an automotive supplier, specifically focusing on software, and maybe there's a little bit of hardware in there too. But it was a really fascinating discussion because it was around MBSE, but it was all in the context of software. So, that system engineering process and using a model to drive it is eminently applicable to software development for end items like vehicles. Um, so he shared a lot of how he was using MBSE for that and the benefits he was realizing. It was just a fascinating discussion. Really happy and because it was such a nice contrast with some of the other interviews we've done with like Laura Otero Hernandez, Brandon Ramsey, uh, McCrae Jones, all those folks that are more hardware or system focused. It's really good to get a software perspective and how that looks a little bit different.
Yeah, it was interesting to me, kind of looking back at the episode and seeing You mentioned kind of working on the software side, and tell me if this touches on what we just talked about, kind of bridging two separate worlds. That you talked about the chassis, right? That they're getting the actual physical part of the automobile. That's not part of their design, like environment. They're not working on that. That's something that's kind of handed to them, and then they're working off of that and within those constraints. And
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting position to be in, right? Because we talk about getting different teams to be able to talk to each other and having the entire product be kind of visible as one entity. But when your company's not really involved in the creation of this piece of the mechanical side, I'm sure that presents its own
Yeah.
quirks and challenges that the practitioners have to work through to figure that out.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, 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 absolutely. But it's really interesting when you look at automotive suppliers that have system level responsibility, but also just as importantly, um, software responsibility. They're often highly specialized in developing code, but getting it to run on target electronics, which, if it's brand new to the world, software is brand new to the world, that is a really difficult dynamic to navigate to make sure that they integrate and work together. Um, but yeah, I mean, the MBSE, kind of the system engineering principles and the use of MBSE as kind of the IT underpinning underneath that are eminently
Hmm.
applicable to just the software side of
Yeah.
things. The RFLP, requirements, functions, logical architecture, physical architecture. Um, you still got to work through that, and you have that structure on the software development side of things. So it's, yeah, again, fascinating topic and a lot of value there for sure.
Yeah, MBSE without the mechanical side of it, but it feels a little bit
Yeah,
like you talked about Agile for hardware, right? Something that was originally software driven in its principles and its creation, having applicability, in kind of a different world, and so maybe crossing the other way, MBSE, being providing some value and some structure that on that software side, even without the physical piece, it still makes sense, right? And still has value as a way to proceed. Another thing that he talked about that I found interesting was the adoption of MBSE, and we all remember it's been 6 years since COVID. I just want to say that since that whole
wow,
thing
that's
started, I know that
crazy.
none of us want to think back to that time, but
Yeah,
it was a prompt for in many industries, right? Okay, well now things that had maybe been in the works for a while as far as collaboration and using technology to bridge some of those communication gaps, suddenly it became, okay, well now we have to do this because people can't be in the
yeah,
same buildings as each other. And it accelerated that. Model-based systems engineering, it is built for that kind of environment. Ideally you can work across geographies. And so, it was a discussion about how that kind of accelerated MBSE adoption and it became a norm. Um, and then kind of the question of whether that is a permanent change, or is that sort of something that happened and now that is the world we live in? Or is there regression? Is there sort of steps going? I mean, I don't necessarily want to say backward, but I think you understand what I mean, reverting
yeah,
back to a
yeah,
place where, because is there the whiteboard in the middle of the shop floor, or the document based approach just had it stood up a little less strongly under those conditions. But now that we're back into some sort of normalcy as far as work patterns go, I'm wondering if that's something that you get a sense of, that mode, that trend continuing, and was COVID sort of a line in the sand, and companies have adopted this, or is there sort of
yeah.
like a waffling now
Mhm.
that we've got a few years on?
Yeah. No, yeah. So it was really interesting to get his perspective on that. That it wasn't just going digital, right? Because you can have document-based systems engineering, DBSE, and that could be a form of digitalization, which everybody during the pandemic figured out a way to move online, and still operate. But the value that they realized was that if you have an unambiguous source of the truth for the system, like a definition, and you have traceability between all these things, um, that was a mechanism or a lever that they could pull to improve collaboration and communication, which interestingly, when, in the latest research study that we conducted, the number one use of MBSE right now is communication and collaboration at 67%. A lot of the more traditional stuff around architecture traceability is further down the line and almost like table stakes. But
Mhm.
yeah, COVID, the pandemic accelerated the use of that in his eyes. And I don't see that regressing. I think we've reached a point of stability for people that moved there. Um, they're staying there.
Yeah. You mentioned the research, and, to kind of bridge that a little bit, the question of what people want. We talked about this last week, I think, what people want out of MBSE solutions and what their kind of stated goals in pursuing those change initiatives around MBSE are and what they actually get out of it, right? And how many of them are achieving kind of levels of collaboration that they find, that this is what we had in our minds, right? We were achieving the goal of using this to improve this aspect of the way that we work, and that there has been a little bit of a lag in achieving some of those goals that have moved beyond the table stakes, right? That you talked about, the kind of baseline expectations of MBSE to things that, have kind of, I think you've used the 1.0 and 2.0 terminology to talk about kind of a new moment in what companies want out of MBSE. And so, I think that in kind of hearing the conversation about where people are going. I wonder if there was kind of, well, we have to do this. There's a rush to adopt. And now that that has become the norm, there's still a little bit of catch up, right? Being played in
Yeah.
terms of getting the value out of the solution that it proposes, right? Or the potential that it sort of holds as a
Yeah.
solution in general.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that there's this concept where, yeah, you adopt a technology, you start using it, and then you reach a new kind of status quo, right? You move from one, it's a step function, and then you stabilize into a new way of operating. And with initiatives, and actually, this gets to resistance.
Mhm.
The more resistance you run into, the more your ability to achieve the initial vision is runs into friction and is suppressed lower than what you expected. So we actually see this in some of the MBD, model-based definition, model-based enterprise research that we're doing right now around that kind of full realization of the vision and the amount of resistance that you run into. Correlation, we haven't figured out causation yet. We just know that they correlate. Um, the overall takeaway here is that you might settle into a mode of work that isn't the ideal or the full completion of the vision. And for example, what Anand told me was that, yeah, we're mainly using this for software. We're not really using it for hardware, which sounded like a state of incomplete vision achievement. Right. So, they are getting value out of it. Make no mistake, they're applying it to software. They're like operating in a new paradigm. Um, but they do electronics development as well. And not spanning both of those might be a compromised realization of the vision.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing, and a point that I know we've made before, that you can adopt a solution. It's not that you're going to see no value out of it or experience total failure. Organizations get value out of their initiatives. Typically, they have success in achieving at least some of those goals, but there are definitely levels, right, to the achievement, and we kind of scope that out in some of our research and presenting the findings as kind of outstanding levels of success. You're achieving, you're checking every box, and maybe even you're checking boxes you didn't realize there were going to be benefits for at the beginning, and you're working your way into that zone. And so, companies being able to assess how much of the total vision, right? How much surface area are we covering right now, and
Yeah.
how much further do we have to go, and sort of making those evaluations so that are squeezing what you can out of the solutions that you have in hand and that you're if not maximizing, at least pushing the rate of return on your investment
Yeah.
up as you sort of realize more value in different areas.
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, and we're seeing a lot of that in the research as well, right? So right now, you know, with research, you always want to try to ask the same thing in two different ways and see if they align.
Hmm.
So with the MBD MBE research, for example, we asked, how would you rate your success for this particular initiative? And it ranged from, didn't realize value all the way up to extreme value, which is good. And we got the normal kind of distribution curve for MBD, MBE. Yet we also ask questions around like, well, okay, what is engineering releasing? Is it a 2D drawing? Is it a 3D model without PMI? Is it a 3D model with PMI? And then what is being used in all the different functional departments? What are they taking in? And then what are they doing with it? And there's more complete kind of realization of a vision represented with those answers. So
Hmm.
the benchmark that we're using, the index that we built was, okay, how much of a complete vision have they realized? And then we're cross-tabbing that with the success rates. And what we found was there are even people that said, yeah, we have extreme success rates, yet they're still using 2D drawings, right?
Yeah.
Which I think speaks to the human nature of this, especially when you talk with change agents, right? They're like, everybody, I think everybody operates in a normalized state. We tend to, whatever we're experiencing, if it lasts long enough, we normalize it and say, hey, that's pretty good.
Hmm.
I'm working really hard, right? And I'm doing the best I can. And given the circumstances, you know, we have achieved success when quantitatively they may not have realized the full vision that they initially set out to achieve.
Yeah. That's really, it's a question of where the goalposts are and your perception of, your, we talked about this previously, right? If you're a change agent and you're answering questions about the success of the initiatives that you are accountable for, how eager are people going to be to say, you know what, this did not work, right? Like
Between you
it
and
is
me,
right. And I think too, but we also talked about, the vision of someone. If you're working in mechanical engineering and, you are working in the models and that is your day-to-day life, you're feeling like, look, we are extracting every piece of value that we can as far as my use of this seems to go. We've talked about MBD being a little bit of a different animal because it is applicable across so many cross-functional areas. You do have these assets being taken out of the development process by different groups that need them, whether it's on the manufacturing side, suppliers. We
yeah,
talked about those last week, and so you're even the person answering the question, their vision of, well, across these other departments and across the entire organization, it's a matter of what are you measuring and how are you thinking in
uh,
terms of success and what you've achieved, and as you point out, you know saying, yeah, we use these models all the time and we can thank them for every product. It's like that can seem, I'm sure, like really robust, valuable usage of it. And for those people's functions, maybe it is. But if you look across
yeah,
the entire organization and that's lacking a little bit, you might just not have visibility into the overall impact if you're kind of in the middle of one of these teams working with a solution and maybe you don't have eyes kind of across those
yeah,
barriers.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And this is where there can be a disconnect, and maybe it's okay to have a disconnect. Or maybe we need to change expectations. There is this in kind of the public industry in this space, we say this is the ultimate vision of what MBD MBE looks like. And if relatively few people, and this may not be true, we're investigating it right now to be determined. If people are not realizing that full vision, is that bad? Is that
Hmm.
okay? Right? Um, if companies are saying they're getting value out of the way they're operating right now and they're comfortable with it, then that can be okay, right? I mean, it's never going to be perfect, and you can't let great be the enemy of good.
Right. Right. Yeah. And we've talked too about just the individualized nature of, what an organization needs and what they may get value out of compared to another organization in a slightly different position. Yeah, and making those decisions about your assessing your own, needs as a company and assessing the value that's most valuable, if that makes sense. What are you getting out of this that kind of really makes a big impact? And if you can say, look, we did these two things and it changed these aspects of our business and we got so much more efficient in this area, and that was enough, for the way that we were working, or it was enough for now. I know you've written a lot about getting small wins, finding
Yeah.
ways to execute and achieve something, and then you can expand that out and move that on. And so I think that's maybe the good news, right? Is whatever level of value you're achieving, that there are opportunities to kind of conduct those assessments and understand what you need and kind of update or tweak things as you go forward as a company.
Yeah, completely agree.
All right, so to jump across to some more research, as we keep talking about research of different kinds, right? We've talked about some of the questions that we asked folks with the study that we ran in November, December of last year, and one of the things we asked was just around initiative, pursuit, and activity, and what are you kind of spending your time and resources pursuing as far as engineering initiatives go right now. Talk a little bit about those findings and where we're kind of seeing the most activity around different initiatives.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So in the study that we conducted, it was December, January-ish,
Okay.
we asked a question, which initiatives are you pursuing? And we gave a list. Um, the number one was MBD, MBE, and that was at 58%. I was really surprised that it was that high.
Mm.
MBD, MBE, which is model-based definitions, model-based enterprise, which is kind of moving to a drawingless approach for mechanical hardware. Uh, engineering releases a 3D model with PMI embedded in it from CAD, and then machining, um, service, quality, um, all those types of functions use it downstream to then create their own deliverables, NC toolpaths and so on and so on. But that was 58%. That was super high. And that initiative is a little bit more mature. So maybe that's why it's higher. Digital engineering, which is kind of specific to aerospace and
Mm.
encapsulates MBD and MBSE, but also some other stuff, came in second at 57%. It was really, really high. And then MBSE came in at 48%. And it's not as long in the tooth as
Mhm.
MBD, MBE, and maybe that's why the numbers are a little bit lower. Mhm. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting to see so much activity around model-based initiatives in varying form,
Yeah.
um, and that they have so much traction right now. So that surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, seeing kind of collectively where companies across the industries that we surveyed are going, um, like you said, in model focused initiatives of different kinds. Do you think that, you mentioned the maturity level relative, between say MBSE and MBD. Do you think also the complexity of MBSE, the learning curve, we talked about that last week as potentially being a barrier and folks, do I want to get into this? Am I biting
Right.
off more than I can chew maybe for different reasons? Do you think that maybe could also be playing a role there in terms of the slightly lower, numbers of folks going after MBSE?
I mean, it could. I think in any of these initiatives, each of them have their kind of unique, nuanced challenges. Like we
Mhm.
talked before about MBD and MBE, how the challenge there is far more political, right?
Mhm.
Extends outside of engineering, how does engineering exert indirect influence over, a manufacturing plant manager or the head of quality, to get them to say, "Hey, you need to have your own initiative so you can use this." That's very different from, say, MBSE, where the big challenge is around people and learning curve and that kind of resistance. It's a different type of resistance. So, mm, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the color commentary looks like, right? Each of these things are unique. But boy, yeah, I mean, adoption levels or pursuit levels are pretty high regardless, and I'm encouraged by that.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely seems what I mean, around half of respondents, pursuing some combination of these initiatives, is definitely a high figure, coming in from the research. We've been, talking a lot about, like I mentioned earlier, you've been interviewing a lot of folks around MBSE. We've put out some content around that. We've got a report coming on the state of MBSE, as well as some other findings to kind of break down and analyze there. So some of the stuff we talked about earlier will kind of bear out in that report. We'll show some, what are people after, what are their expectations versus what they're actually achieving, and what that might mean. Um, and we're kind of right now on the calendar, like straddling the line a little bit between MBSE stuff and that content coming out, as well as the MBD and MBE side of things. And I know that we have, as we did with MBSE, some podcast, guests lined up, some conversations coming out around that. But I know that this is also an opportunity to kind of reach out to potential guests and kind of tell them a little bit about what do we want to talk about with MBD? What are we interested in? Because we want to hear
Yeah.
from folks right out in the community who are having conversations about this stuff and living this stuff out as their daily reality.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the MBD side, it we're actually looking at kind of three separate reports there. And Josh, you know this, you're writing them. Um, One is the state of things. Where are we as an industry in terms of pursuit and adoption and success and resistance with all that stuff? Kind of at a global level. The second one is going to dive into the politics, and how, with MBD, you better have your CEO on board, because this extends outside of engineering. You're going to need to get suppliers in your sourcing slash procurement team on board with it, because it affects that. It affects manufacturing. It affects quality. So that's the second one. And the third one is benchmarking, right?
Mhm.
We're separating respondents into how much they have realized the full vision of MBE. And there's low, medium, and high for that. We're going to change the names of the groups, but directionally, you understand where I'm going. And
Mhm.
then understand, okay, what, how does that vary by um, success and resistance across those groups? What does that look like? And by the way, early findings are all three groups, low, medium, and high, kind of realization and vision, they all have the same levels of resistance. Yet, when you look at low, medium, and high, success rates are much higher with the high group. Um, so, so I found that very interesting. And then, part of that as well is what impact does a change agent have on that?
Mhm.
We've seen just very recently, generically across initiatives, we've seen that having a change agent formally kind of lead your initiative, um, they don't change the level of resistance you experience as an organization. It's going to be the same. People resist change. It's like a law I'm learning. It doesn't, like, that persists across all these things.
Mhm.
But having a change agent leads to higher rates of success. And that leads to that concept of change agents don't suppress resistance. They go in and see it as an opportunity. They see it as a way to engage. They see it as a way to judo flip that momentum into participation and investment by people that often resist those efforts. So having skilled change agents, and there certainly is a technical byline that runs through that.
Mhm.
But the other byline that's often ignored is kind of the research, the insights, the skills, the emotional intelligence, the soft skills to engage people and get them to kind of flip their attitude towards that and become a contributor to the initiative.
Yeah. Yeah. Hearing their concerns voiced, having their concerns addressed, and
Right.
seeing, oh, there's evidence that I provided feedback that that was taken into account, that it's being applied to the initiative. You will win converts, and you will have people become advocates who were previously hesitant if you can treat their concerns as valid, right? Treat their concerns, like we've said 1,000 times, as feedback on what the initiative might need, or at least what concerns you might have to address within your organization, to get to that. And you talked about soft skills. One thing that has come up on your podcast interviews several times, and that we've touched on, I think, briefly, is also, you know, the communication with executives. You talked about having your executives on board, and we know that executive support, I think, is higher, meaningfully higher in organizations that achieve high levels of success. But for an initiative like MBD or MBE, where you have to touch multiple departments, that you have to influence without authority, right? We've talked about that, not having that kind of org chart lever to pull to say, you have to do this. I'm telling you to. Having that and the ability to also to bridge the gap between what's actually happening at the practitioner level and its ROI for the executives, right? Making the business case
Mhm.
and tying that stuff together as well can be a skill for change agents. And it feels like for an initiative like MBD, where you have such a wide berth of potential impact across the company, that having that ability to sort of communicate that clearly so that the executive support, stays
Yeah.
consistent, that it is
Mhm.
backed up by the business case, because ultimately that group is going to be moved by that bottom line figure and what can be done, to make those changes.
Mhm.
So I think it's interesting to see all of that stuff kind of come across. I think the people talking about that we're talking about MBSE, which has its own costs and things to be rationalized and justified as well. And it works for
Yeah.
MBD as well. But when you mentioned, the importance of having that executive support, because you are going to have to kind of reach across the organization. So, yeah, I'm as always interested to see how that stuff breaks down, and where the findings kind of point us, in terms of, you know,
Yeah.
what people should do then next, right? I mean, if that's what they need to do, how can they set those change agent roles up to complement each other and work effectively?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think, even, one of our recommendations in the success versus the resistance paradox, which is the report that's coming out soon, kind of looks across all initiatives. One of the really one of the great kind of recommendations that we include in there is that, okay, as an executive, yes, you need to communicate the vision, you need to drive alignment and all those types of things. But also culturally, you need to change it such that resistance isn't, it's not frowned upon. You need to come out and say, hey, productive resistance, where you participate in the process, where you make this initiative better. That is the right way to frame it. And then we know, okay, we understand that there's going to be resistance with this initiative, and that's okay. Come and talk to us. We're going to try to accommodate you as much as we can. We want you to invest in this initiative, but that kind of the old school resistance is bad, uh, either gets you to extreme resistance, which is outright rebellion. Okay, you asking me to make this change? I cannot get the 2028, model year
Mhm.
done on time. It's going to put that at risk, right? That's the form that extreme resistance takes. And you don't want to be at the other end where there's no resistance, because that means it's gone underground,
Mhm.
right? And suddenly you have a silent rebellion brewing in your organization. You want it right in the middle so you can engage it, and you can interact with it. But also, a key part of that is culturally, it means you have to make resistance acceptable.
That's true. Yeah, resistance and as we've talked about, the willingness to put something out there to, as the change agent to say, here's what we're thinking, and be okay with the feedback that someone says that I don't like that at all, right? And you have to have a thick skin yourself and be able to navigate that. But yeah, I think eager to get all of that stuff kind of out in the world and to keep doing research and kind of peeling back the layers of the onion to to figure out kind of what the most valuable findings are there. All right, we're going to close with this. I'm going to give you a chance. I want you to pitch the folks who are out there in the world of model-based definition and model-based enterprise, because these are the people that we want to hear from. We want them to come on Change by Design and sit down with you and talk about what they're experiencing so that we can do a lot of what we've been talking about, learn more from them and sort of position our efforts so that we're being as helpful as we can be in helping folks make decisions. So bring us your podcast guests.
Right. Yeah, exactly. With MBSE, boy, we've had a lot of interviews. I would say it's 8 to 10, but Josh, you might know specifically, but it's in that range.
It's definitely in that range. Yeah.
Really good insights. We're sharing those insights. We're actually going to be doing an analysis of those conversations to understand what are the through lines and the takeaways. But yeah, we're turning our attention more towards MBD and MBE, model-based definitions, model-based enterprise. So if you're leading an initiative in that space, ping me, like send me a message on LinkedIn, and let's talk. I mean, we're actively looking for guests. We have a number of them lined up already, but yeah, I'd love to get into more of those conversations. It's such a fascinating initiative to kind of dive into and see what people are doing from a practitioner's perspective to actually realize that value. So yeah, I mean, you can come on. I mean, we have a pretty, a good distribution in terms of who listens to it and who watches it on YouTube. And also, we promote it on LinkedIn. So, if you look at my posts, you'll see McCrae Jones and Laura Otero Hernandez and Brandon Ramsey. I take clips of that. And I love to talk about it, give my own perspective, but highlight them as guests and their expertise in the industry. So yeah, we'd love to hear from more folks that are interested in coming on the show. And the more perspectives, the better.
Yeah, a really valuable part of the community that we talk about, right, are the practitioners who can come on and kind of share their expertise, who are experienced and comfortable kind of doing that. And like you said, we've had a ton of great guests. And I think that, if I can toot our horn a little bit, it is an opportunity to position yourself a little bit as an expert, right, in this area, because you are engaging people across industries on LinkedIn. And, we do want to be very contributor forward, I think, in how we talk about this stuff and really highlight the expertise, because, getting that input from them and getting those boots on the ground stories and kind of their day-to-day, lives and what this stuff means for them. It provides a different kind of insight and perspective for us to respond to than the research does, right? Which is obviously spread across a large group. And I think both are, really helpful. So yeah, come on the podcast, position yourself like you almost certainly are as an expert in MBD if you're listening to, or if you're leading one of these change initiatives, because yeah, we want to learn from you. And I know that our audience is eager to, to find out kind of what others are experiencing who are in the same world and matching their experiences up and trying to understand kind of where they sit in the big picture. So come on board, talk to Chad, and we will spread your wisdom far and wide on the Change by Design podcast. So Chad, thanks as always for the conversation. Really enjoyed talking about this stuff. Stay tuned for podcast episodes that are coming out, as well as the reports and research stuff that we mentioned. Excited to get that out into the world. Thank you all for listening. Chad, thanks as always. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you. Great job hosting as always.
Thanks. Take care.